Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the autumn lecture for 2013. For those of you who don't know me, I'm called David Hare. I've got the privilege of being the president of the Institute and Faculty for the next 9 months, unless I get sacked beforehand. I don't know if it ever happened, but I'm sure there's a first time for that. Hopefully it won't happen to me, because it's actually a really thrilling thing to do, to have a chance to help lead the profession towards the mission and vision that we've set ourselves, the quite ambitious strategy that we have, but also to then to reassess and just be sure that we've got the right strategy for the world as it changes. And we've got quite a few of our council members here, and we've been having a very interesting session just trying to see ourselves as others see us, and in particular having some key figures from the city and regulators telling us, their perceptions of actuaries and the future for us. So there'll be more about that in due course in the Actuary magazine articles that I write and things like that. But in the meantime, this evening, there's no fire alarm scheduled for tonight. So if it happens, it's for real. You'll see various signs, and we need to head out. The conference staff will be on hand to make sure we all get out safely. The event is being filmed, so hello everybody in Beijing. Nice to see you, or at least nice to have you with us, if only by video. But yeah, as you know, we're an international organization. More than half our students and nearly half our total membership are outside the UK. And it's really important that everybody gets an equivalent experience of being a member of the Institute and Faculty, and part of that is that all events like this are recorded and put on the web. So hope the viewers are enjoying it at home. We're certainly going to enjoy it here. So what that then means is that when we do the Q&A, if you could definitely wait until the mic comes, and then folk in other parts of the world will know who's asking the question and hear it. And also, if you could turn your phone off just now, that will help us to avoid disturbing the session. Okay, one of the things that we're trying to do in the profession is to make sure we're as relevant as possible to all the different issues in the world of finance. And so what we want, part of our program of that is to look for as many cross-practice events as possible. And part of that is we have our series of lectures. I think it's nice as a past faculty person that the faculty introduced the faculty lecture, and we've kind of extended that now as part of the Institute and Faculty. And we now have 2 lectures a year, spring and an autumn one in London and one here. And we've had some very eminent speakers speaking, and tonight is no exception, and we're absolutely thrilled that Bob has come to speak to us, and I'll introduce you later on properly. But we hope you'll find this an interesting, stimulating evening. And particularly if you haven't thought yet of becoming an actuary, you might be so thrilled by tonight that you think, this is the career for me. And that's my segue in to some prizes that we have to award before we get started. We give prizes through the Scottish Board for the best pupils in higher maths exams in various, we've got various schools represented this evening. We've actually given 6 prizes for 2012. Only one from 2013. I'm not quite sure what that says about the standards of education in schools or not, but I'm sure there's a good reason for that Martin Potter, the chair of the Scottish Board, can tell us later. But we've got Callum Malloy and Jack Holligan here, who have both won prizes. The 2012 exam is Callum. Callum went to Mearns Castle School. I lived along the road from Mearns Castle, which was nice when I was living in Glasgow. So we're going to ask Callum to come up just now. He's now studying mathematical physics at Edinburgh University. But please join me in congratulating Callum on a very good performance in higher maths in the past. Well, Callum's there, sorry. Well done, thanks very much. And I've got a goodie prize for you as well, but we're going to get your photo taken. Thanks, and here's a goodie bag. There you go. Well done. Well done. And the other prize for the higher maths goes to Jack Holligan. Jack is from George Heriot School. He's also at Edinburgh University now studying maths and physics. Jack, I presume that's you, so congratulations. I looked the right way this time. Congratulations. Well done.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Great. There's that. And a goodie bag for you too.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Sadly, being the best postgrad actuarial student at Heriot University only gets you a certificate. It doesn't get you a goodie bag, since I presume Ewan already gets the actuary and things like that. But Ewan Chalmers, I presume that must be you. I was looking at you for the wrong thing. But Ewan, please come up. Ewan won the prize for the best postgrad student, as I was saying, at Heriot Watt. Well done. That's you. Congratulations. Great achievement. There you go. Well done. Thank you. Nearly there. Next prize is for Ian Rogers, an ex-colleague of mine in Standard Life, but he now works for KPMG and is going from strength to strength in his career. And Ian has won the prize for the best student in ST9. And those of you who aren't familiar with the new syllabus, that's the ERM exam that was introduced a couple of years ago and is one of the sort of the flagship parts of the CERA qualification throughout the world. And Ian was the best student in that. So well done, sir. Come up and get your certificate. Well done. Great. Great. Smile sweetly. Very good. Great. Thank you. Okay. This is only the second time I've ever got to present an honorary fellowship. And I can't think of somebody actually I would rather present it to. John Hibbert, I used to think, was an actuary. And I discovered with some surprise several years ago, after he'd taken part in a panel for us at a sessional meeting, that he wasn't an actuary at all. And I'm so glad that we're about to correct that. And honorary fellowships are given for a number of different criteria, but it's mainly people who have served the profession well and served actuarial science well and advanced things in particular ways. And John, everybody knows the name Barry and Hibbert, even though you've now dropped the brand actually to call yourselves Moody's Analytics. But Barry and Hibbert was a very famous name because actually it changed the way we thought so much in life insurance about capital modelling and this type of thing. And Andrew Barry and John set up this firm, and certainly I was in a research group at the time in the faculty, and they helped to really develop our thinking, and that led to various papers. But what they've actually led is not just academic papers, but actually a change in business modelling. And in fact, the Barry and Hibbert ESG for a long time has been one of the standard ESG engines that people use in insurance. John graduated in economics and accounting from Bristol, operation research from LSE. And as I've said, is probably best known in the industry for the work he has done, both on the research side, the papers he's written, but also the difference that he and his colleagues have made to insurance company modelling. So John, please come up and receive this honorary fellowship from us with very good wishes and many congratulations. There you go, well done. Very good. Thanks. John's going to say a few words. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Don't worry, that I'm not going to be speaking for very long. Thank you all very much for this. This was put, of course, to a vote of actuaries, so I really do feel genuinely honoured by it. And in particular, because I've worked with actuaries for so many years, and despite their reputation, I'd even consider a few of you to be my friends now. So I'll speak for 5 minutes. Now, I suppose, as David says, I'm not an authentic actuary, and I would have to describe myself as a financial economist, albeit one with quite a strong quantitative bias. And I'd like to say a few words about the relationship between actuaries and economists and other experts. In particular, I want to highlight the importance of communication, the sharing of ideas across these professions, the language used for communication by experts, and the importance of healthy, well-explained skepticism in those interactions. Although I'm talking about actuaries and economists, I could make the same comments about economists and mathematicians, or physicists as well. And I've plenty of first-hand experience of trying to get all of these groups working constructively together in financial organisations. I'd like to make this point because I think some of the best achievements of actuaries and economists are where communication has been strongest and most effective, and some of the failures and frustrations that many of us have felt have often been the result of poor communication of what are often very complicated ideas and complicated problems. And I'll just highlight one example from my own field. Most of my work over the past 30 years or so has been concerned with the behaviour of asset prices and the risks that result from that behaviour for savers and for financial institutions, kind of capital modelling that David alluded to a minute ago. And I first came across actuaries as an economist working for a life insurance company in the 1980s. And I have to admit, it was a pretty strange experience. Here were a group of people focused on problems that were familiar to me, but who used quite unfamiliar language. We talked about the force of interest, reversionary and terminal bonuses, estate, and a whole bunch of other unfamiliar terms. They also held views, often implicitly rather than explicitly, which were at odds with the then conventional economic thinking. Whereas among economists, the fashion was for efficient markets, rational investors with options priced using arbitrage arguments. Actuaries talked about mean reversion in equity prices without terribly strong justification, and then built this view of the world into their models, their advice to financial institutions, and product designs. For example, the smoothing of returns in with-profit savings products. Now, given the traumatic market experience of the mid-1970s, particularly in the UK, this view of asset price behaviour is not very surprising at all. And it's worth appreciating what's happened in terms of thinking among actuaries and financial economists over the past few decades since then, since the early 80s. And I think it's fair to say that actuaries have at times struggled to directly engage in the sort of mainstream financial economic debate on asset pricing and communicate their views. There's no doubt that today's actuaries, I think, are far better equipped than previous generations through the changes to actuarial training, far better equipped to engage directly in this ongoing technical debate. And it is not a debate that has been resolved, certainly among economists or actuaries. And I like to think my old firm and its actuaries have contributed in a positive way to this dialogue. Now, of course, there are far more financial economists than actuaries thinking about asset pricing, so it's not surprising that financial economists have led this debate and the development of thinking. However, I think what's really interesting is in recent years, especially following the financial crisis, there's been a marked shift in thinking among economists. And I don't think it's unreasonable to describe this as a shift towards the sort of views that were attributed to actuaries in the past. We seem to be moving not quite full circle, but certainly three-quarters circle to some of those actuarial ideas that were fashionable 30 years ago. As an example, John Cochrane, a leading financial academic in the United States, in his 2011 presidential address to the American Finance Association on discount rates, which is a neat summary of the rethink that's underway and well worth reading if you have a general interest in this topic. Although his address was on discount rates, essentially it's about the way asset prices behave. And Cochrane's view, in summary, was that after decades of active research across many institutions, economists have just about figured out what the questions are. I think he would quite honestly say, we know what the questions are now, but we really don't know what the answers are. We have an agenda. And importantly, he highlighted a kind of shift from a sort of fashionable view that asset price changes were all about changing expectations, if you like, changing expectations for profits and dividends and underlying cash flows, to a view that the primary driver for asset price changes may actually be variation in discount rates themselves, risk and liquidity premia embedded into asset prices. And this would be especially so during periods of financial stress. And these ideas, of course, imply some sort of reversion in asset prices, the sort of reversion that I think actuaries were arguing for in the past. So these questions of how asset prices are determined are of absolutely profound importance to actuaries in the work that they do. But these changes in the consensus over the past 30 years have been driven by financial economists. And it seems to me an absolutely key challenge for actuaries and the profession. And this applies both within organisations and in relationships with other professions and other organisations, is still around communication and understanding the language that is necessary in order to engage in these important dialogues. So that's the thought I'd like to leave with you. Obviously, I'll try to continue to do my small piece in communicating with all my actuarial friends in the future. And thank you all very much.
Okay, thanks very much, John. We now turn to the main event for this evening, and that is Bob Black's address to us. When I was reading Bob's CV, it was a glittering array of public service and I think sort of oversight and scrutiny of the vast sums of money which are spent keeping our country going. Robert started off in the West in Strathclyde and has gradually moved through various important roles to culminating in being the first Auditor General for Scotland when the Parliament was set up. That was from February 2000 until 2012 he held that post. I had no idea that the Scottish Parliament spent over 30 billion a year. It's a vast sum of money. And Bob was in charge of overseeing the sort of the audit of that and reporting on the expenditure of what was going on in our country. Robert has, as I say, got extensive experience in the provision of public services and the policy around that. And as actuaries, we're particularly interested in this, where one of our priority areas is pensions, but not just pensions on its own, but linking that with long-term care and other aspects of sort of providing for people in retirement. We've also recently set up a resources and an environment board. There's a lot of actuaries who are really interested in how we can bring our skill set to bear on some of the big policy issues that are going on in that sphere. And so while this may not seem like a typical actuarial subject for a talk, I think it's very relevant to the sort of profession that we want to be and the skills that we have. And so, Bob, we look forward very much to your address to us this evening. Thank you.
I hope our technical advisors here will forgive me if I ask the first rather cheeky question. Can you hear me all right at the back? Excellent, jolly good. It shows I've been on a platform a few times over the years. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. It's the first time I have addressed a body of actuaries. This morning I was with the ICAS, the Institute of Chartered Accountants down at Haymarket, and this afternoon I'm with the actuaries. I know how to have fun in my retirement, I might say. It's very good. Independence is the big issue of the day, but I haven't given myself that title for a number of reasons. The first is, as a citizen of Scotland, I have nothing special to say on the issue of independence. Secondly, I'm a coward. It's too hot an issue. Thirdly, when you look at the debate that we're still a year to go to this referendum, 18th of September next year, when you consider the debate we're having so far in Scotland, I think it's not too unkind to say that we've succeeded in identifying the known unknowns, large numbers of them, but we are not doing quite so well in converting the unknowns into the knowns. So I have no special insight in these matters, so I'm going to steer clear of that, but very happy to engage in a conversation afterwards on any issues that you might find are important or of relevance to you. But the main reason why I'm going to avoid sidestep the independence referendum per se is that there are a whole set of issues which are not being talked about sufficiently in Scotland at the moment, I think, and indeed in the UK. And that in Scottish public life, it's all about independence. And there were three sets of issues I would quite like to touch on with you. First is the obvious one, which is the austerity issue. These are the challenges facing all governments about the role of the state in public services and making that fit with the new fiscal realities of the world in which we live. and they're posing real challenges to political parties to frame a narrative that fits the new era of austerity. The second interesting set of issues is that there's actually, in the short life of the Scottish Parliament, been a remarkable policy divergence between Scotland and England in terms of public service and how we do government, with implications, I think, for both countries. There are now quite noticeable differences in the models of public service delivery, and there are questions to be asked about which model is likely to be more successful than the other. So I'm going to touch on that. And finally, I think whatever the outcome of the independence referendum, whether it's independence or status quo or something in the middle, sometimes called Devo Max, it's going to raise some significant implications, I think, for the unwritten informal constitution of the United Kingdom. And I suspect that some people, not least countless millions of friends south of the border, are kind of sleepwalking into this. So I might touch on some of that. For those of you who concentrated rightly on your actuarial studies, or those of you who have come north of the border, I'm going to start with a brief history lesson around this, particularly related to the independence issue. I mean, Scotland was a sovereign state until 1603, until we gave a long-term loan of our monarch to England. We had our own parliament till 1707. And clearly, we controlled our destiny pretty well for most of the last 300 years. The Scottish Office was created in the late 19th century and took responsibility for most of the services which matter in the daily lives of the people of Scotland. And in effect, you could say that the process of formal devolution and the creation of the Scottish Parliament was not much more than putting a political mandate alongside the administrative devolution, which had existed for a long time. So that's rather different from the situation in England. Because of its long history as a sovereign state, and more recently as an politically empowered, devolved administration, Scotland is rather different from the regions of England, where the administration and governance is much more embedded completely in the UK state. So, the nature of the debate about Scotland's future must be understood in that context. Just a reminder of one or two of the numbers, which your President has already given you. The Scottish Parliament is reliant for its financial resources primarily on annual grant from the UK government. In 2011-12, the block grant from Westminster was £30.5 billion. There are other sources of revenue generated within Scotland, for example, council tax revenue and so on. But most of the money comes from Westminster, and most of it is distributed by the Scottish Government on the say-so of the Parliament to public bodies in Scotland, health bodies and local government and so on and so forth. And it's calculated, as I'm sure many of you will know, in a block and formula system, which by your standards, ladies and gentlemen, is a relatively simple arithmetic formula. Basically, we get our share of the baseline budget uplifted by whatever uplift is applied to the United Kingdom and based on the population, sure. What a lot of people don't fully appreciate, although I'm sure you do, is that the Scotland Act, which was passed in 2012, is going to devolve significantly more powers for raising revenues to the Scottish Parliament, with a new rate of income tax due to be in place by April 2016. This will reduce the UK rate of tax by 10% for Scottish taxpayers, and the grant paid by the Secretary of State for Scotland to the Scottish Parliament will be reduced by a corresponding amount. And the Scottish Parliament and government are charged with imposing whatever tax they think is appropriate to plug that gap. From April 2015, there will be full devolution of stamp duty and landfill tax, and the introduction of capital borrowing powers for the Scottish Parliament. There's not much recognition of these realities in the independence debate at the moment. There are significant devolved powers in the control of the Scottish Parliament, and these are going to increase. The issue is whether or not they will be used, particularly in relation to tax varying powers. There's been little sign of that so far. Since the Scottish Parliament was primarily a spending body and not a taxing body, the focus over the first decade of its life was undoubtedly on how and where to spend more money each year. No doubt about that. This meant, in my opinion, I can now speak frankly because I'm retired, more frankly than perhaps I would have done when I was in harness, so to speak. It's great fun re-engaging with your opinions, I have to say. But it does mean that during the first decade or so, productivity incentives were really rather absent. Then, of course, came the spending crunch, which we all know about. And the Scottish Government, who'd been motoring along quite happily in its top spending year, 5% real growth per annum throughout most of the first decade of the millennium, the most benign public spending environment, I think, probably in history, certainly in my lifetime, which is pretty close to history these days. So it was motoring along in top spending year, and suddenly within the space of 18 months, it had to crash into reverse. And that's beginning to change the attitude to productivity and performance, but we're starting a long way back on that agenda. And certainly the political narrative in Scotland is really still only coming to terms with what this means. So that's the context of where we are now. I'd now like to turn to some of the challenges facing Scotland, with the emphasis, as my talk title implies, upon public services. The global perspective. I mean, Scotland is a small, open economy in a part of the island off the northwest corner of the European landmass, and we are not isolated from global changes. I need hardly tell an audience like this the harsh realities. We've got growing global competition. We've got the growing middle classes in the erstwhile developing nations who aspire to lifestyles at least as generous as we have done. We've got the long-term, unavoidable, remorseless pressure on natural resources, which in turn is helping to feed some of the regional conflicts that we see around the world. So as a small, open economy, we need to be aware of that. And when we're talking about the future of public services and affordability and priorities, we should be doing it in that context. Closer to home, there are some major challenges for our public services. There's an excellent small research institute called the Centre for Public Policy for Regions, which does some really good analysis. A couple of economists there does really good analysis. And they're saying that we are just over halfway through the public sector cuts that are going to be required by around about 2016 and 17. They're saying that the reductions in capital spending have pretty well occurred. We've taken the hit there. But most of the reductions in resource spending, that's the day-to-day running costs of the health service, schools and police and so on, has still to come. And the process of fiscal consolidation in the UK, as we all know, is taking longer than was anticipated because of the pretty anemic rate of economic recovery. So the period of austerity in fiscal terms is certainly going to extend well beyond the independence referendum and probably beyond the UK parliamentary election, and pretty well probably beyond the next Scottish parliamentary elections. Some budgets are still being protected in relative terms, particularly in the health service. Less so in Scotland, actually. There's been a convergence in per capita spending in health between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. But there have been protected areas of service, such as the health service, school spending, pensioner benefits, a swathe of householder benefits, not least the freezing of the council tax. So that led to the Institute for Fiscal Studies to say that over the lifetime of the spending review and a little bit beyond, we are facing cuts of something around 25% or more real in all the other public services, by a quarter, let's say, in real terms. And that's a conservative estimate. And that includes the whole of local government. In one of the publications, IFS actually uses unusually strong and frank language. It says that cuts of this magnitude look close to inconceivable. That's not me saying that, that's the IFS saying that, and they're a pretty authoritative body. So, those are the fiscal pressures. To the extent that the media cover these things, it tends to be on that side, the cuts in resources. It gets worse, because there are very enormous pressures building up on the cost side. My erstwhile colleagues in Audit Scotland emphasised back in 2009 that over £500 million, 512 million, would be needed to deal with all the outstanding maintenance issues in the Scottish NHS. That includes capital, the buildings, but also major items of capital equipment. By December of last year, the Scottish Government itself was reporting a maintenance backlog of almost £750 million, £773 million in NHS property, facilities and maintenance. In 2009, Audit Scotland said that the maintenance backlog in relation to local government assets amounted to 1.4 billion, and that was an underestimate because quite a number of councils couldn't give us the information. And then in 2011, another Audit Scotland report said the condition of Scotland's roads had declined since 2025, and the latest estimate for improving the network to an acceptable condition was £2.25 billion. And then, and I need not say this to this audience, but I have to touch on it with all due humility, there are the potential costs associated with the ageing population, with the number of Scots pensioners increasing by 80% between 2010 and 2060, and most of that increase concentrated between now and 2035. So there are some scary estimates about the extra billions that are needed, that would be needed to pay for the health and social care for all us people that are going to enter decrepitude at some stage during the next couple of decades. Free personal nursing care costs have been rising about 15% a year. They're well north of £500 million now. Drug prescribing costs have more than doubled in the last decade to above £1.5 billion. And then we've got small change, but nevertheless important issues about free prescriptions and eye tests amounting to about £150 million and rising. One of the issues that grabs the media headlines is the bus passes and whether or not that is a good idea. All I will say in that is the Audit Scotland projections, which were not really challenged by the government, was that that will rise to close to £500 million over the next decade. And the latest numbers there are over 1.2 million people out of Scotland's 5 million or so population, almost a quarter of the population, now have a free bus pass. And that's costing £180 million a year. Many other pressures I could go on about. Not least, for example, the council tax fees. There is no such thing as a free lunch or a free service. And whilst council taxes are frozen, the gap has got to be plugged. And again, we're talking about in round order of magnitude 400 to 500 million by resources from elsewhere in the Scottish budget. So that's where we are at the moment. Just going back for a quick second to the maintenance budget, much of that backlog has been built up during the years of plenty, during the years of 5% real growth year on year. How on earth, as a society, are we going to cope with this in the era of austerity? It's going to be a challenge. Do you hear the politicians talking about that issue? When the Scottish Parliament's agreeing a budget, there are rarely, if any, ever headlines about things like the maintenance crisis in our infrastructure, but surely there are some real political issues here. I would give you a couple. In the first place, a poor infrastructure affects potential economic growth, given that we're in the global environment, competing against the Singapores of this world and the rising cities of China with the new infrastructure. Secondly, there's an ethical issue. There's a major question about the legacy we are leaving our children and grandchildren. Unless these backlogs in maintenance and repair are addressed, we are passing on to our children and grandchildren a stock of physical assets in worse condition than they are now. Why should future generations have to pay in some way, either in terms of lost opportunity and quality of service or extra taxation? Why should they have to pay for our excess consumption of physical assets? There's not only that intergenerational question, there's another one. If you look at the relatively protected areas of service, they do tend to favour the current generation of older people, of which, of course, I am one. If you look at health service spendings, significantly biased towards the elderly and is protected. Free bus passes, protected for all time. Council tax fees tends to favour people who are of more mature years with property. The state pension and the benefit system, all tend to be biased towards the older It's a sweeping generalization, but I think it does hold up. So we need to find a way of engaging in a political debate about some of these challenging issues. We cannot simply ignore them. Changing the realities changing the narrative, political narrative to reflect these hard realities ain't going to be easy. Political parties, not only in Scotland, but across the whole of Europe, are struggling with this. You know, in most of our living memories, there hasn't really been the need on a sustained long-term basis to face issues of retrenchment. Let's assume that the trend rate of growth doesn't get back to 2.5%. Let's say on an optimistic scenario, we manage a trend rate of 1% rate of growth. That's certainly going to make tough choices unavoidable given the aging population and so on. In Scotland, there has been an efficient government programme which has been a small contribution to getting costs down. But the size of the cuts that are going to be likely over the next number of years really is going to require a fundamental rethink of policies and priorities. The hard reality of that is only now beginning to have an impact. In welfare spending, we can see some of the pressures coming through and the cuts in some of the disability allowances and so on. Then there's the notorious bedroom tax. In the mainstream services, we can also see some effects coming through, such as the closure of local libraries, which are beginning to appear in the newspapers, and local police stations. In Scotland here, the Police Scotland just announced that they would like to close something like 70 local police stations. That's only the start, ladies and gentlemen. Let me give you one important example of a major public policy issue which is not easy for political leaders. It's an example from the health service. Since the health service receives some pushing 11 billion out of the 30 billion or so that comes from Westminster in the block grant. So it's not a bad area to take an example from. Created in 1948, as we all know. Since then, I need not tell this audience, life expectancy has increased by some 12 years, and people aged 60 or over are making up nearly a quarter of the British population. Half of those over 60 have some kind of chronic illness. That proportion is going to rise as more of the population reaches 85 or older. Nearly 2/3 of the patients admitted to hospital are over 65, and around a quarter of hospital inpatients have a diagnosis of dementia. And people over 85 now account for 22% of all days spent in hospital beds. In a recent report, the Royal College of Physicians came out of the closet and argued that under existing service structures, the way we do things now, older people are going to be caught in outmoded pathways of care focused on managing single diseases at substantial cost with little coordination across the hospital and the wider sort of care industry, if I may use that phrase. The college said that to treat patients with complex and multiple conditions, the future of the health service has to rely on some kind of collaborative models of patient care, bringing primary care, secondary care, and social services together. Let me quote from the report. It's a really, really interesting and important document because it's coming from the clinicians who know about this stuff. In the evolving model, the focus of care should be on prevention or anticipation of acute illnesses, preventative spend, and anticipatory spend rather than crisis response. Prevention or anticipation of acute illnesses managed by escalating personal and clinical care in the community rather than defaulting to hospital admission. This is a cause of so much of the pressure on hospital beds and waiting times. We need to get to seamless care for patients across all settings using modern IT, they go on to say, which requires investment and redesigning services, centered on the patient's needs in the community. Given the straitjacket that's now around our public finances, how are governments going to find the resources for this sort of structural change and service redesign? It requires investment. It requires investment in modern IT and new training and new kinds of discipline. It's bad enough at the moment trying to persuade politicians to take seriously closing old and redundant health buildings. The history of the Scottish acute sectors, full of stories about the problems of getting old buildings closed for understandable reasons, but we've got to somehow find a way of changing the political narrative. Generally speaking, one inhibiting factor making life difficult for our political class is that the quality of public services in Scotland, not least in the health service, are actually pretty good. They are really quite good. And as Jim Collins said many years ago, the good can be the enemy of the great, and that's a real issue for public service reform. Why risk something is performing adequately for future benefit? That's always the political challenge. And it's kind of understandable that politicians tend to avoid engaging in such matters, given the intense competition at the ballot box, which seems to take place remorselessly with all the election cycles that we're facing. And of course, next year we've got additional competition at the ballot box with the independence referendum, which, as you may recall, when I started out my remarks, I said there's perhaps stifling debate around some of the tough issues that we're facing in Scotland. Of course, a further challenge that politicians face that in every difficult issue, there is almost certainly going to be an interest group, strong voices, either for or against, with votes and influence. It's a challenge for all political parties in these times because they're all experiencing rapid declines in their own party membership at the same time as the RSPB and the National Trust can get any of us to sign up almost. We'd much rather give our money to protecting birds than to a political party. Will Hutton wrote an article recently in The Observer, and he said this, which I thought was rather good. Parties have been the engine room of democracies. They gather a constellation of interests around a common set of principles that offer a compass for government. But with intense pressures on the public economy, who's going to set this vision for mediating the different competing interests in society? Who's going to have the authorization and the authority to take a strategic long-term view given the remorseless cycle of elections? So, that's unrelieved pessimism, I suppose, up until now. This doesn't come naturally to our retired Auditor General. I'm very comfortable with the glass is half empty, ladies and gentlemen. Let me go outside my comfort zone and talk about the glass is half full for a moment or two. We have relatively high spending per capita in Scotland. We are still, roughly speaking, 10% ahead, 10% per capita ahead of the UK as a whole. So we are well resourced. Most of our public services are of a good standard, as I've mentioned already. We actually have pretty high standards in public life. The media tends to concentrate on the occasional peccadillo and minor scandal, but we have got high standards in public life, and our state services on the whole work well. Sometimes when we look around the world, we should count our blessings, you know. The Scottish Police Service is coming to terms with very dramatic cuts in its budget, and they're managing to do that, for example. The devolved governments in Scotland actually do some very good policy making. I don't have the time to describe them this evening, but I mean, we've got the high-profile innovative policies like the smoking ban, which came in first in Scotland, but there are some very good policies in place. For example, around the early years framework, around tackling health inequalities, about getting it right for every child, about tackling poverty and income inequality, about reshaping care for older people, about a sustainable housing strategy. Now, the problem is that these are worthy, well-reasoned words on paper. Turning it into a reality is always difficult. Implementation is always the hard part, and doing it in the era of cuts is going to be even more difficult. But nevertheless, we do policy making actually quite well. The Scottish Government is a world leader, actually, in the development of outcome-based policy development. And we've still a long way to go to link that to budgets, but we're recognized globally as doing pretty well in that field. But there is actually a remarkably swift policy divergence between England and Scotland. Quite remarkable, much greater than I think any of us anticipated, certainly than I did, in the first decade or so of devolution. Some of these policy differences have had media coverage, such as free post-school education in Scotland and the introduction of a range of services like free bus passes and so on. But one of the most significant policy divergences have been around what some of you may have heard of as the new public management, which is basically about introducing competition and contestability into public services. All governments at the UK level, regardless of their political colour, have continued to develop the new public management thinking and have sustained a process of developing competition and contestability in public services. But in Scotland, generally speaking, all administrations have shied away from or actively discouraged competition and the involvement of the private sector in many of our core public services. Let me give you a couple of examples. Compulsory competitive tendering used to be around in Scotland. That's been abolished in local government for many years now. And then in the early 80s, the residual elements of the internal market, which is now very much a feature in England, were taken out of the equation with the abolition of the health trusts and the consolidation of everything into the 14 health boards, both strategy development, budgeting, and service provision. Comprehensive education still survives in Scotland. We've got the 32 education authorities, pretty well in the form in which they were when I was at school, by and large. No equivalent to the academy free school model being developed in England. Another notable example is probably in policing policy. Down south, they now have 43 forces with a system of elected police commissioners. At the same time as that legislation was going through Westminster, the Scottish Parliament was passing a bill which was going to remove the 8 police forces in Scotland and create a single Scottish police authority and police force. And the board members are appointed by the Scottish government. Diametrically opposed policy directions to achieve the same aim of a more accountable, more efficient and effective police service fit for modern times. So, if there is such a thing as a theory of how to improve public services in Scotland, it ain't around competition and contestability. It's something to do with a belief in integration and cooperation, and that should prevail rather than competition. There is a challenge question for the government in England, undoubtedly, by this sort of fragmentation through competition and contestability. How is the government in England at Westminster going to be assured that the public sector will be able to take a joined-up whole systems approach, which is essential if, for example, patients, the elderly, other clients, are going to receive the integrated packages of health and social care which meet their needs if everyone's operating in separate sort of silos of delivery in a competitive environment? Now, I can't begin to answer that question, but I do think it's an important one to ask. There's an equally important challenge question for Scotland, going down its somewhat different path. If in Scotland is not going to generally favour competition and contestability as a means of reducing cost and promoting diversity and innovation in service design, if that's not the way forward, how is the state going to incentivise and drive performance and productivity improvement in service redesign? Again, I don't have a simple answer, but it sure as heck is a big issue for all of us in Scottish society, not least given that we can no longer tolerate inefficiency and poor productivity because of the austerity era that we're now went into. I'm in no doubt that competition in ideas, competition in bringing innovative processes and service into the market for goods and services should be a part of the agenda for improving public services. In other words, I think competition and cooperation are a bit like the yin and yang of public services. I don't have much Chinese philosophy, I have to say, but in a sense, you need both. You need both in balance, the yin and yang of public sector management. All yin and no yang, all cooperation and no competition is unlikely to make our economy, our public economy, operate more efficiently. So what's the answer then? Well, part of the answer might be to strengthen our institutional framework in Scotland. Remember, the politicians find it difficult to engage openly in a narrative around this for all the reasons that I've outlined. I've suggested in the recent past that perhaps the Scottish Parliament and us in Scotland, the Scottish society, should have some kind of independent body. Let's call it a Commission on Resources and Performance, which would be a resource for the Parliament and all the political class, which did the hard analytical stuff around some of these issues, and which informed a robust, systematic cycle of performance reviews of our major public services. It would remove the noise in the system in Scotland around whose numbers are best and provide an objective analytical foundation of evidence which can then be applied in the political arena. I also believe that a body like that should actually search out and promote service redesign that really works wherever they find it. If you want an example of some of the difficulties you've got in Scotland, you'll be aware in this room, I'm sure, that a couple of weeks ago the Scottish Government produced a report on pensions under independence. And the cheap headline on the Scotland Sunday, for which I'm sure the Scottish Government is in no way accountable, was that vote for independence and the prospect of early retirement will be better. People read that stuff, they don't read below it. Now, I've read that report. I'm not a pensions expert, but there are many, many points in the analysis where I say, I read that, I'm not convinced. In fact, I'm rather inclined to the opposite view. But that's out there in the public domain. That is seen as authoritative government publication. Incidentally, in the modern day and age, I wonder about the pressure on civil servants to, what's the word I'm looking for? To be comfortable with the publication of documents like that. In the old days, the civil service had actually been a source of objective challenge around some of these things. Now, I'm not saying that that paper is wrong, but I am saying that we need to look critically at its content, and we need to lay it alongside the analysis undertaken by other independent entities of worth and draw some conclusions about that. There's nowhere in Scotland that happens. Seriously happens. There are debates in Parliament, but they're not robust, evidence-based debates. So, I do think it's a really important issue, and I think it's an important issue not just for Scotland, it's an important issue for all mature democracies. The need to create some kind of institutional framework which can actually tell the truth to power and tell the truth to the public about some of these really big, tough issues which we're facing in Scottish society. In Scotland, I talked about, I mentioned that partnerships and cooperation seem to be the way forward for in Scottish public life. I'm a great favour of that. I think it's absolutely right. I think it's right that we should use partnerships to break down barriers between institutions and so on. But without going into the detail, because I really don't have the time, all the work to be done in Northern Scotland around how partnerships operate leaves a big question mark about whether they really deliver added quality and whether they contribute at all to cost efficiency. But nevertheless, if we're going to go in that direction, there are some really significant issues to think about here. This thought didn't really occur to me when we acquired a Scottish Parliament. I thought bringing services closer to Scotland, better level of debate, fits with a civic society. It's probably a good thing. And I still believe in the Scottish Parliament. But what I hadn't fully grasped, of course, is that the Scottish Parliament doesn't actually deliver anything. It takes money from Westminster, approves a budget, passes laws, speaks for the people of Scotland. It doesn't actually deliver anything. It's quite remote in systemic terms for frontline service delivery, and that's a real issue. And there is, I think, for Scotland, some big issues in there. And the next phase of the evolving process of devolution, whether or not we head for independence, surely has to be getting the Parliament and the Scottish Government closer to the realities of the pressures at the front line, so to speak, of service delivery, and looking at some of these really tough issues about joining up health and social care and so on and so forth. We actually need to create places where politicians can address these issues. I mean, after all, it's a privilege as well as an achievement to be elected at the ballot box, but you wouldn't expect to run the company after you pass the job interview, would you? you know. You expect to go through some kind of training and career development. Now, I have a high regard for our political class generally, and in that Scottish Parliament, which I knew quite well, there's some very, very able young people, but a lot of them are career political animals. And there's no place really where they can go and sit in a safe environment to talk about this kind of stuff, to listen to chief executives of the health service or senior people from the model colleges about what needs to change to re-engineer our health and care services for the modern era, so they get time to reflect. There's no time to reflect because of the remorseless cycle of elections and budgets and media scrutiny and so on and so forth. So I have suggested that we need to create places where it's possible for politicians to come together. And we've got an excellent higher education sector, some great universities. We've got bodies like the Royal Society of Edinburgh and so on. I think these bodies could do more to help that happen. My final theme, I'm watching my watch here quite closely now. The implications of devolution or independence for the UK state. Mainly devolution. Independence, we know, is going to be a huge breakpoint in the history of Scotland. But let me just unpack that a little bit more, just for a second or two. Opinion polling seems to be consistently indicating that bar unforeseen events, nearby events, the chances are that the majority will be for maintaining the link with the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not making a political point, that's simply what the polls are telling us. So let's say we're sticking with the devolved model, and it seems highly likely that under devolution, more powers will come to the Scottish Parliament, even above the 2012 Scotland Act, which is giving a lot of power, which we don't talk enough about, how we're going to use those powers. We just want even more power in the form of independence. Let's just step back and look at one or two of the realities. I mean, I'm an optimist. I mean, I've talked about the pessimistic side of the picture, but I'm an optimist. I mean, Scotland is relatively well represented in sectors with growth potential in which it's got a comparative advantage, such as energy, medical research, higher education, food and drink, financial services, and so on. Given these structural strengths, and given that we've got really strong state institutions in Scotland, not least in the higher education sector, but also in large parts of government, the government machine, and we've actually got institutions which support economic development, which they don't have in the regions of England. One might have reservations about Scottish enterprise. I'm not qualified to speak, but we do have a strong body there with a very high-powered board whose focuses upon the economic development of Scotland. We've got all that. I would imagine that I would put my money on Scotland's economy being relatively successful in the coming decades. So we've got the Scottish Parliament steadily accruing more powers, possibly accruing more powers in the future, including aspects of welfare policy. As Scotland is successful, what's the chances that some other regions of the United Kingdom might say, you know what, we would like some of this stuff. Why is everything that we do controlled from some kind of central machine in Whitehall, in Westminster? Sometimes I've called it over a pint in a pub, the Starship Enterprise model of government. You know, the bedroom tax is applied from Westminster everywhere from Orkney to Cornwall to inner London boroughs. Is that really the best form of government? I'm just suggesting that perhaps at some stage in the future there might be a kind of revisiting of how the UK government does its business. And we might see something of a pressure towards a more devolved, if not entirely federal system south of the border. And Scottish devolution will have that effect in the longer term. With a powerful and relatively successful devolved state in Scotland, we will have as a society, UK-wide, to find an answer to that Tam Dalyell West Lothian question, which some of you may recall, whereby Scottish MPs can vote on matters which exclusively or mainly affect the people in England, and indeed Scottish MPs may and have been elected to high office in the United Kingdom and hold sway over matters in relation to health and education and community safety in England when the powers are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So there's definitely an asymmetry there. There's also a reverse asymmetry, if you can have such a thing, an inverse of the West Lothian question, namely the power that a Westminster Parliament might have in the future. Let's say a Parliament of a different political colour, let's say one of a significantly right-wing persuasion, to impose unwelcome legislation in Scotland, which has voted differently at its own hustings. An example of this from a somewhat distant past, which had severe consequences for the party concerned, was, of course, the community charge, commonly called the poll tax, which came in when I was a very young and inexperienced chief executive. But you could see the problems of it before they introduced it. A feature example, of course, a serious example might be policy divergence over the European Union between the UK state and the Scottish state. The legal possibility that Westminster could abolish the Scottish Parliament will sooner or later, in my opinion, have to be made a constitutional impossibility. As Lord David Steele, who was, of course, the first presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, put it in a lecture at the David Hume Institute, he said this: "No self-respecting Parliament should rely upon the goodwill of another Parliament for its very existence. The Holyrood Parliament is a creature of statute over the long term by the Westminster Parliament, and it should not be liable to be abolished unless it so agrees. And Westminster should no longer have the capacity to legislate over areas of it," which I think is a thought worth bearing in mind and reflecting on. So at some stage, I think this issue about the constitutional settlement and the nature of the unwritten constitution of the UK will have to be revisited. Very finally, note of optimism. Small governments with strong governance and state institutions, a strong economy, a vibrant intellectual energy and high skill levels, which I think we have in Scotland, I think stand a good chance of showing over the long term that they have a comparative advantage over larger centralized states, not least in rethinking and redesigning how we do our public services. But we need courage to address those issues. But small governments do have the capacity to join up better how government works, and also to have conversations with the citizens about how we jointly face the challenges and the opportunities which lie ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. We asked Bob to speak for 45 minutes, and I think you spoke bang on that. I'm very impressed. And that gives us good time, some time left for some questions from the floor. And if you remember, I asked if you could give your name. Well, actually, if you could wait for the microphone and then give your name, then we'll know who's asking the question. And this is the moment that every chairman of session or meetings fears when he says, "Is there anybody who would like to ask the first question?" I look around for a show of hands. Good question here, Catherine Morgan, a council member of the Institute and Faculty. Catherine.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really interesting, particularly for me as I'm English, so I related very strongly to your comments about the Westminster Parliament, but B, I'm from Yorkshire, so your comments about English regions perhaps wanting to follow Scotland's example resonated with me, and I think when I tell my father, he'll be quite excited about it.
I'm suffering from sinusitis at the moment. Could you help me with what the question was?
Oh, right. It's no question yet.
No question.
I've becoming from a cold. It goes straight into my ear. So,
my question is, if Scotland does become independent, do you think there will be no restriction on immigration into Scotland so that you get more young people to try and solve the proportions of ageing and young people? Because then you could have more young workers in to support the older people.
In a company of actuaries, I hesitate to answer that question, to be perfectly honest, because you will all know, I'm sure, that there's actually been, it's part really of the relative success of the Scottish economy, there's been a reversal of the net migration. I mean, when I was in the early part of my career, we had net out migration consistently over the years. And now we've got net in migration of a significant number. So there's no doubt that it can make a contribution to the Scottish economy. It would require one of you ladies and gentlemen to work out whether it's going to make a significant impact, because I'm not sure that I understand the numbers. But Europe and immigration policy is one of the known unknowns about all of this. Because if Scotland, let's say Scotland were independent and it were applying for membership of the European Union, or there almost by right, as our First Minister would believe will be the case, I'm hedging my bets here, trying to be balanced, I would imagine that there will A, be pressure to sign up to the single currency, and B, that there will certainly be pressure to sign up to the Schengen Agreement, which is the open borders. And of course, Schengen is a hugely controversial issue for all political parties across the whole of Europe. And I find it very difficult to believe that a new acceding state would be allowed to opt out of Schengen when all the other nation states are having to cope with open borders. That takes you to an interesting place with regard to the rest of the United Kingdom. And of course, it's a cheap shot perhaps for politicians to say there'll be borders in Scotland. But there are some real tensions there, I think. Not least because I think in Scotland there is a recognition that the nature of the immigrant population that we are receiving here is actually making a significant contribution to wealth. So it's one of the known unknowns as to how that would play out, actually. I think I'll be using that answer to quite a number of questions on independence. All we can do is to kind of recognize the issues that are in there which are not yet being resolved.
There's another good answer, which is it's not as simple as that. That's another good line that actually used a lot too. Great. Okay, next question. Thank you, Catherine. Good question up at the back there. Jerry.
My name's Jerry Deviney. Robert, first of all, thanks for the talk. I'd like to pick up briefly on the white paper for pensions that you mentioned that was published last month. I share your views on the fact that there doesn't seem to be a body, an independent body that's informing the public, and we desperately need one. It's rather embarrassing that I had to listen to a lawyer talk about the issues of life expectancy and longevity on the eve of its publication, rather than another specialist such as an actuary. So my question is, were your comments about the need for an independent body a call to arms to us, the actuarial profession?
Absolutely, yes. If you care to take up the challenge, that would be excellent. I was with a small number of fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh giving evidence to the Finance Committee of the Parliament just last week. It wasn't seminar format, but it wasn't private, and I think it's in the official report. And the Royal Society of Edinburgh have actually accepted the need for some kind of entity like this. They use the phrase independent fiscal institute. Now, the precise role, powers, accountabilities, and so on of a body like that would require some very careful thinking. And the RSC is its core kind of suggestion to government and the Scottish Parliament is, look, you need to recognise the need for something like this, and you need to set up a group that's actually going to look at it objectively. So I think there is, John Swinney, as the Finance Secretary, has kind of recognised that if we get an independent government, then we will require something like an OBR type function. The problem I have is that it's yet another one of my known unknowns, because the precise institutional solution in Scotland would have to depend on the constitutional result. If Scotland is independent, then a body that, I think it's an open and shut argument that a body is going to be required. And in my view, it needs to go beyond an OBR type body, which is tending to look at the public finances out ahead. It needs to be something that embraces something of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and does some real hard analysis of the future shape of public services. We've also got bodies, as you will well know, such as the UK Statistics Authority. So a lot of the core data sets that really matter in the public sector are kite marked, if you like, quality assured by the UK Statistics Authority. So under an independent Scotland, that would be absolutely essential. That would be essential housekeeping to have some kind of body that guaranteed the objectivity and robustness and accuracy of all government statistics. Will that be in the white paper? It might be now, because some of us have been raising it with government. Sorry, a long answer, but I do think that if we think of the more likely outcome of, on the basis of the polls, of existing devolution plus a bit, we do need a body that's going to address the issues of productivity and efficiency, I think. We simply can't sit back and let the situation drift.
Thanks, Ian. Next question. Great. We are. Colin.
Thank you. In your speech, you pointed to a number of areas where there was strife. So one I'd pick on as an example would be potential intergenerational strife between the old and the young. And you've referenced the possibility of some of the difficult questions that arise in that being helped by an analytical body. But in the end, it's going to be the politicians who have to solve the problems. And I guess, on the basis of your experience, do you believe our politicians can deliver on that?
Yes, I do. If there's a willpower there, and I do have some experience of this. The Public Audit Committee of the Parliament doesn't get that much media coverage unless it's tackling some big issue like the Edinburgh trams or the Hollywood building project or whatever, a big what went wrong project. The day-to-day bread and butter work tends not to get covered. But over the years, particularly out of the performance review stuff, we've presented to the Parliament, and the Audit Scotland is still doing this, high-quality analytical reports of some of these pressures. And these have always had a good and fair reception from the Public Audit Committee. The difficulty is in getting that translated back through into the political system and to influence the manifestos and the agendas of the political parties. That's really difficult. And therefore the model has to be, quite frankly, to use plain English, a body of analysts to do this stuff, taken to an authoritative body appointed by the Parliament of really senior and experienced people who can give the meaning and significance to that. So they take reports to the Parliament, which effectively are laying out the reality of what's ahead for us. So that in turn, politicians of different parties can say, we accept that as the baseline from which we now engage in a political debate. Yeah? But it does mean doing things rather differently than we've done in the past. And it means, I think it's such an important issue because somehow we need to find a way of helping our democracy to work more effectively. And it's really difficult because of this treadmill of elections to get long-term thinking into the system. Our political class, in my opinion, in a sense, almost needs some assistance to do some of this stuff.
Oh, a flurry. A question there and then a question down here. We'll go to this one up here, if that's okay, and then we'll come back to you. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. My name's Jack Whiteford. In terms of the scrutiny that you might be able to apply to issues, etc., is it something that should be brought in terms of a bicameral parliament? Should that scrutiny be applied by maybe senior legislators who have a longer term in office and who have, bring certain expert skills? At least there would be some element of election associated with them. I think the issue that you're describing is a sort of nomenclatura organisation. So perhaps bringing that elected element to it might be more beneficial.
Yeah. I really don't feel qualified to speak about the Camel Parliament issue. I mean, a lot of thought went into the design of the Scottish Parliament, and the judgment was taken that a single chamber was appropriate for a devolved parliament like Scotland, particularly one established under proportional representation. Now, there is a view that we need some form of revising chamber or check and balance, but that takes you into the really difficult area of what's the authority of that body if it's not directly elected. It has to be directly elected, and then you get into the whole Scottish equivalent of the dilemma over the future of the House of Lords. You know, it's a really tough issue, that the idea of creating a second chamber. Goodness me, we've got elected local government councils and elected MPs and elected MSPs and elected European MEPs. We're well served in that sense. And I think that my personal view is the way to get through this is to have an entity which clearly reports to the Parliament in plain English, well-evidenced reports, and then passes that on to the Parliament to consider objectively. I mean, when one speaks with politicians in private, there's a remarkable similarity of view about the challenges which Scotland is facing and what needs to be done. But it's very difficult to unlock the politics without that kind of robust evidence base, which is provided by an authoritative body, reporting to and accountable to the Parliament itself, but standing slightly to one side. There are models in other countries. And the example I sometimes quote is the Australian Productivity Commission, which is a really interesting body, which does some of this stuff for the Australian government.
Thanks. And we had a question down here when you go.
In actual fact, I was going to ask exactly the question about whether there should be a revising chamber. So I think you've pretty much answered it, except for one aspect, which was only a very few weeks ago, a sheriff rather publicly described the legislation which came out of the Scottish Parliament as, and I use his words, mince, which suggests that at the very least some form of expert side arrangement that could actually pull back or rein in some of the political excesses would be almost essential under an independent Scotland.
Yeah, I recognise that view, but as an ex-honorary auditor, I hear what you say. Now show me the evidence. I suspect the evidence will be mixed about the quality of legislation that's been passed by the Scottish Parliament. Some of it has been highly successful, like the smoking ban. A lot of the other stuff around, well, I'm not going to go there. You might question. Frankly, I mean, I would be very happy to think in terms of mandatory requirement to have a post-legislative scrutiny conducted by people who are suitably qualified, let's say 4 or 5 years into the operation of an act of the Scottish Parliament. So you might have to live with it in the short term. Now, but the point being that way you are not actually cutting across the proper mandate of elected members to make legislation, but you would actually have some kind of post-legislative scrutiny as to how it is operating. I think that personally, I think there's a case for that. And you know, in partial defence of the committees of the Parliament, the pre-legislative scrutiny that they apply to bills is something that they commit a lot of time and effort to. The result may or may not resemble mince in some instances, but we do have that system, and some of the legislation is the better for it, I think it's fair to say. So, again, thank you. It's not as simple as that.
Anybody got a last question? Yep, here's a question in the front, second front row. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you. My name's Jean Urquhart, and I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament. And I'm on the Finance Committee and was at the roundtable discussion that you took part in last week.
Yes.
I'm very interested to hear all that you say. I have too many points, really. I possibly want to take issue with just about everything that you've said in one way or another. Some of it very positive. But I wonder, on the known unknowns, whether there's, I think, a deficit in the known unknowns of remaining in the Union. That, in fact, it's not only about not understanding everything that will happen as a result of independence, but the result of what might not happen. And a couple of times you referred to Devo Max, but Devo Max isn't an option that for people to consider, because it's not and was not allowed to be on the ballot paper.
I think that's a fair point, actually. I mean, I couldn't disagree with that.
Okay. That's a nice, that's a nice point of agreement to finish. Yes. I'm not sure whether you wanted to say anything more, Gina, on any other, if there's any sort of factual or modelling, or it's not that actually he's only thinking about modelling, but in terms of some of the numbers that we've talked about here, it's been quite interesting. So, I mean, if you want to make some comments, we have a few minutes.
Well, I have, and I think that I'm very new. I'm green behind the ears. I've only been in the Parliament for the last 2 years, just over. And I do recognise much of what Robert Black is saying in terms of external scrutiny. I mean, I think that is something that the Parliament itself will have to consider and look at happening, and I think because it's necessary. And these things are not a mystery to people who are in the chamber, really, that they become, I think they'll become obvious. And I would only just say that the Parliament is only 14 years old. It's an incredibly new institution. And you're right, we do have some extraordinarily good institutions in Scotland. My observation at the moment is that they don't engage with the Parliament enough. Or I think one example is our universities, where there is some remarkably good research carried out, and yet we haven't found a good way, I think, of engaging with the Parliament in terms of using that research. But other observations, I mean, you mentioned the free bus pass and so on as something that, can we maintain that? But you also mentioned that there was preventative spend, and that really comes into that category. And what we are seeing in a very short space of time is actually, older people really taking advantage of that and living longer and happier and out of the health service. So I think there are, for all of these things, there is, it may not appear like it every time, but there are good reasons for doing these things. And the biggest spend in the health service is still around alcohol and other abuse of substances. So I think that we mustn't either make young people or old people some kind of, great burden on the state, when in fact they are a great asset to the state.
Okay.
I think, otherwise I'll go through the whole speech, so I don't really want to do any more of that.
Just a quick thought on that, if I may. The concessionary travel scheme, which everyone agrees is a good thing, and I agree it's a good thing as well. And I do think that it does have that benefit of allowing retired people and older people to get around in the communities and so on. Absolutely accept that. But when it was introduced, in my opinion, more attention and thought should have been given to the variety of schemes that were run by the local authorities before the national scheme came in. And there were some really interesting schemes in there which provided a service to small groups, vulnerable groups, who are not covered by the free bus pass. People with mental health problems and so on. Some of the local authority schemes did that. That's the first point. The second point was it really necessary to design a universal scheme that allows people like me, relatively well off, to travel from Wick to Wigton for nothing, because that's not a free good, obviously. It costs something. And I think, back to point the gentleman made was referring to there. In some aspects, the quality of the pre-legislative scrutiny wasn't great. And also in relation to concessionary travel, I'm pretty confident that the rapid escalation of the cost was not fully factored in, because a financial memorandum prepared by the government of the day was flawed. It wasn't sufficiently robust, and it didn't have an upside-downside risk analysis in it. So we kind of got into that. The trouble is that once people get that kind of service, that gift from government, it becomes an entitlement, and you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. Now, we must get through that era and think of doing this differently in Scotland. But I agree with you absolutely about the Parliament being a relatively young institution. I agree with you about the pressures on the time of politicians is enormous, which is why I think we need to find other ways of engaging the wider civic society in supporting the democratic process. And I think creating some of these institutional solutions might be part of the answer. It was Chu Enlai who was asked about the impact of the French Revolution on communism, wasn't it? And he said, it's too early to tell. Well, I mean, 14 years is no time at all.
I think we could talk for quite a lot longer. I would love to know what your advice would be to the Scottish Board of the Engineering Faculty, who leads our work in Scotland, and some of the research work and projects we've done to try and help inform the debate. But I see that the chairman of our Scottish Board, Martin, sitting down there, so we might corner you afterwards for that, since I'm sure everybody else is thinking, oh, keep the time
Indeed
right.
So
I wouldn't want
well.
to sort of push people's patience anymore. But we're about to go downstairs to have a wine reception, if you're able to stay. But then declaring the meeting closed, I would just like to ask everybody to join me in thanking Bob again for a very stimulating address. Thank you very much.